Good evening. I'm Jabari Morris, and this is MMT Mondays. Lately, we've seen a lot of small strikes from workers at Amazon to Kellogg's and BlackRock to fight the abusive system of capitalism. Tonight, we will show how a federal job guarantee will allow workers more leverage over their bosses in the workplace and the economy in general. Also, we are doing our year-end fundraiser that will provide a 100% match to every donation given, thanks to a very generous donor. The link to the fundraiser will be in the description below. Make sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons, and let's get to it. On this episode of Macaroni and Cheese, Fadhel Kaboub of Denison University speaks to the way the federal job guarantee bridges the disconnect between the extremely important yet unprofitable work needed in society today. He also highlights how the Scandinavian tripod model of governance allows for workers to be at the negotiating table.
Caring for people, caring for the community, caring for the elderly, for children, and caring for the planet. Because that's the most valuable work, valuable from a broader human and social perspective. And that's the type of work that's often neglected by the metrics of the market because it doesn't generate profits. It doesn't generate, quote unquote, economic growth in the traditional kind of narrow sense of the term. So we have all of these benefits.
Let me ask you a quick question, though, Fadhel. In terms of market, does this only work in a market economy? This could work in a command economy, too. There's nothing that prevents this from working in a mixed economy, in which we have.
Well, of course, you can design a job guarantee in any economic system. Command economies, obviously, you lose the freedom of choice and things like that. But mixed economies, and we can talk here about the Scandinavian model, which is actually the closest you can think of in terms of job guarantee and safety net system. Especially a country like Sweden historically had a very strong commitment to full employment. And it is a mixed economy in the sense that the government and labor have a very important political and economic role. Think of this tripod system where you have government, business, and labor unions building consensus around all major economic and social issues. So if the country enters a recession because of technological transition, because of international trade competitiveness and things like that, and the country feels like there's a major need for a technological upgrade in the private sector, and that would displace workers, you can't do that without actually having workers at the table, without having governments, elected officials who represent the people be part of the conversation about what happens to those workers that will be displaced because of this technological transformation. In the US, for example, this happens without having workers on the table, sometimes with governments participating and encouraging the private sector to displace workers. So we're talking about a socio-economic and political consensus, a social contract that doesn't throw people under the bus as the economy changes over time.
Dr. Bill Mitchell, one of the founders of MMT, discusses how the job guarantee will improve the conditions of workers.
Considering a well-targeted, a well-designed job guarantee that also provides transition from these bad sectors like coal mining and forms of employment that are toxic to society and harm us. The idea of providing them a just transition into other forms of employment, another way of seeing this, another aspect of moving to a more inclusive and just society. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Way back when I first started writing about this in the late 1970s, believe it or not, gosh, one of the things that I noted was that in the 1960s, when we had very low unemployment, like below 2%, and a federal government would lose an election in Australia if unemployment crept above 2%, we had a sort of dynamically efficient economy. And what did I mean by that is that job vacancies were always running ahead of the unemployed pool. And what that did was force the bosses to not only offer job positions, slots, work opportunities, but they were also forced then to take whoever they could find and mold them into the specific needs of the job through job-specific training. And so there was never skill shortages or difficulty in finding workers. There was always difficulty finding workers. Firms had to work overtime to make sure that they extracted workers, paid them decently, had good working conditions so that they were attractive workplaces to come to, and because of the shortage of workers available. And that was very efficient and dynamic. And my view is that if we go back to an economy where we really push unemployment right down to its irreducible minimum through a job guarantee. Now, I'll come back to that point I was about to make, but let me finish this point. And we make the worst, in inverted commas, jobs in society decent. So the job guaranteed work become decent work, where there's secure conditions, opportunities for training and upskilling and upward mobility, income security, not pernicious workplaces, oppressive workplaces. Well, then maybe that becomes an attractor to workers in the gig economy who are increasingly exploited in low-income, precarious work. It's just obvious that the private sector then has to change its modus that was relevant when there was a big pool of unemployed and underemployed labour, where they could get away with various work practices and nefarious type of dealings with their workers and not offer them training, etc. Once you alter that context and eliminate the unemployment, well, then the firms have to change their behaviour radically. So that's a win-win. But the point I stopped at and was going to make, and then I decided not to logically in order, is this, that a lot of people who criticise MMT economists think that the job guarantee is the end of the story. And for me, the government should aim at all times to make the job guarantee as small a pool of people as possible. It should be the last resort, not the first resort. And in general, the public sector should be creating well-paid, secure, career-oriented, high-skilled work that really pushes the boundaries of society into high technology, high skill, high pay, and not see the job guarantee as the end of the story. The job guarantee is the essential, basic necessity, but it's not what we should aspire to as the solution.
In this clip, the author of The Case for the Job Guarantee, Pavlina Tcherneva, explains how polarization of U.S. society is used against the public to prevent democratic changes to the economy.
The way I think about this is as a basically Titanic crashing into, the iceberg. You see it. You really can't reverse course. You can't, slow it down. And so the system is essentially sort of breaking up the seams. What is happening now is not a product of one police brutality, whether it is COVID, all of the other problems that we see in the world today are really just the tip of the iceberg. We have had for so long policies that have stretched families, communities, that have used racism and sexism to create social polarization as manifests in economic polarization. I mean, one thing is connected to another. And people are understandably angry. There are many who are out of work. And that adds another layer of destitution that we have not experienced in a very long time, certainly not since the Great Depression. And whether we go through such a dramatic period of economic devastation depends very much on what we do now. And so I think what you say is correct. If people are angry and they direct their anger at leadership, we certainly have good reason to be angry at a president who incites violence. But you're correct to say that we've got to be able to offer something new, something that is meaningful, that provides structural change. And that's where the conversation needs to go in terms of rethinking this post COVID world, right? You hear these conversations in the articles, what would the world look like after COVID? And so I think it's really important to raise this question. And I'm glad to see it from different corners, but we also have to have something specific to offer that is different from the patchwork of weak policies we had in the post war era that were systematically weakened further in the post Reagan era and that created the precarity. So, just to give you some examples, I know you know these numbers and you've gone over them many times on your show, but you know, half of Americans, about 44% of Americans earn less than $18,000. You know, that is the median income, 44%. So we are really looking at folks who can barely make ends meet. You cannot build an economy on such precarious economic conditions. And then when you look at who has lost jobs, you know, we say last in, first out. This is kind of a saying labor economists use to say that there are certain folks who are always the last ones to catch the train of the expansion and get some employment opportunities. But as soon as there's a hiccup, as soon as there is a downturn, they're the first ones to lose their jobs. They tend to be folks with low wage folks. And now, what is happening in this pandemic, we're noticing 40% of job losses are concentrated in incomes below $40,000, right? 40%. And then, 20% of job losses are between 40,000 and 100,000. And then there is, another 13 or 12 or 13% above 100,000. So, no, the pain is not shared equally. And the pain is born in these structural ways where we are attempting to build an economy on the backs of working families that earn despicably low wages. And then when we have an extraordinary crisis like this, of course, they're the first ones to lose their jobs. At the same time, we painfully, realize how dependent we are on those folks to do some very basic work. We call them now essential workers, but we underpay them. They work in terrible conditions. They are the ones that die in the meatpacking industries in order to feed the rest of us. That is such a fundamentally broken system. It cannot continue. And what we need to, I think, arrive at is a moment of reckoning. I certainly hope of the sort that we had during the New Deal when FDR and his team put in place what were at the time radical policy proposals. Do you imagine, elderly folks without social security, zero? Imagine that world of very high elderly poverty rates. So what we need to do is do something like that going forward. We know that FDR didn't really complete the mission. We know he had economic bill of rights, and the first of those was the right to a job to everyone at all times, not just in a Great Depression, not in a COVID, in a good time. If somebody needs work, that's what we need to provide. Decent, not poverty paying work. So we do have a lot of work to do. And I'm hoping that this is the sort of moment of reckoning to put in place these policies. But what I've been doing more recently in my writing is not just talk about the job guarantee, but again, challenge us to think about unemployment as something that's not really natural, but it's a policy choice. And, when we talk about nationalizing payroll or various other policies, there are just different ways to respond to COVID without sacrificing a people's employment.
In the last clip, Cindy Banyai, candidate for U.S. Congress, explains the ideal of participatory governance when it comes to budgeting, which the job guarantee allows.
I want to hear your take on participatory budgeting, though. I'd love to hear a crash course in participatory budgeting.
I mean, honestly, it is what it sounds like. You have the pot of money for a government. It works better, honestly, with smaller government entities. And you can make it as broad or as narrow. I've seen it in a lot of different ways where maybe the city council will say, okay, this is our fixed budget, right? So it's our road, the police department, and the whatever, the buildings. These are kind of like, we have to have this money, right? But then there's the rest of the expenditure that is programs and school supports or whatever, right? That's softer. And then you engage people in a process through prioritizing their needs and wants for the community. And frankly, just that part of listening to what people need and want is hugely important and missing often, right? And then you start to get people to put relative percentages or whatever based on what they want into those programs. You just can't do it like that. I've seen other places where they do it where the municipal government will give whatever, here are the pockets of money for these things that we know are prioritized. And then they will open it even to like a grant kind of process for the people in the city to get funds for it. So they really take it even out of the city's purview. It's a public-private partnership or partnership with nonprofits to do things, but they have to engage in this highly participatory process. I've seen it where it also has to be place-based too, right? So it'll be
Mm.
this neighborhood has this pot of money and this one and this one. And I love it because it not only is just this really engaging process, but you get additional benefits from that process. People care about their community more. People meet their neighbors. They develop relationships. Here's the kicker, and this is in my dissertation, this is in my book, that when you do that, you have amplifying effects afterwards. So those people that met each other through a participatory budgeting meeting and they were engaged in the process, they find out they both love beer and they're both home brewers. They're like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we set up our own little business of a brewery here? And then they set up, and now you have a new business. And that's like a very, very brief example, but I'm telling you from my research, this happens all the time. This is actually how we spur development in communities. And this doesn't have to be really sophisticated communities. Communities of all kinds around the world is we give space to people to connect with one another, to have a meaningful part in the process, and to have a vested interest in that community where they are. The benefits are astronomical, and it goes everything from mental health to safety in the community to businesses.
Tonight, we show clips from 4 separate episodes of our Macaroni and Cheese podcast. And this is just on the federal job guarantee. Avid listeners will agree that this series provides a wealth of information that will leave you wanting to dig deeper into other subjects that the host, our very own Steve Grumbine, covers. As you can see, the job guarantee does give workers a voice in their communities through participatory governance and budgeting. FJG provides a stable footing for workers to demand that corporations do their part in creating an equitable labor marketplace. If you enjoyed tonight's video, make sure to check us out at realprogressives.org and subscribe to get notifications on new video streams on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, Facebook, and Rockfin. If you can contribute, your year-end donations will be matched until December 31st, 2021. Thank you, and continue learning.